Hi, everyone. Before we get started, I thought I'd just say a quick hello. It's so silent on here.
Hi, Chantelle. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
Meredith,
I don't know if it's showing up for you guys, but it says my name's Megan. Megan,
yeah,
on here
hi.
twice.
I was looking at how come Chantelle has my name, I wonder?
I'm not sure. Everyone's had your name that's come in, which is very strange. Everyone's been Megan O'Shaughnessy. So
that's confusing.
It's very confusing.
I'm so sorry.
It's not your fault at all. You should be able to rename yourself Chantelle and change your name in the chat.
Yeah, just in case people get confused.
Just in case. We have quite a few doppelgangers.
I am introducing you, but not as myself.
So guys, my dog is, I'm at my clinic right now and my dog is like, actually he's standing at the door. So I'm just going to get him because he's freaked.
Sure, no worries. Okay, well, let's get started.
Lauren, I'm going to take him because he's like freaking out. I'll bring him in when you're when I'm done.
Okay.
Come say hi. Oh, hi guys. This is Source. He's also a sexologist. He's a horny sexologist, so he's not very consensual and he doesn't really do the right thing in the clinic rooms. He peed in here this morning as well, so he's just a naughty dog. But he's super needy. He'll probably be next to me the whole time or sitting on my lap, I think.
Wonderful. All right, well, we might get started. Take it away, Jess.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Let's Talk About Sex, an online sexual health forum for people with a disability and those that support them. My name is Jess and I work as part of the Diversexy team at cohealth. Before we begin, we'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting on today. For me here, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that out to the lands you are all joining us from today. If you know who the traditional custodians are from where you are located, please share that in the chat. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Thanks, Jess. My name is Luke, and I also work for the Diversexy program. Let's Talk About Sex is an opportunity for people with a disability and those that support them, including carers, service providers, and support workers, to come together and learn about the best ways we can advocate for and support the wider sorry, I've lost my place, guys. The
wider disability community.
Yeah, the wider disability. Yeah. The wider disability community. We are excited to have some excellent presenters for this forum, including well-known sexologist and sex educator Chantelle Otten, LGBTQIA+, and disability advocate Jax Jacki Brown, and two touching base staff, President Sol Isbister and training coordinator Emma Softly. This forum has been put on by the Diversexy team at cohealth. Diversexy is a sexual rights and relationships program for people with a disability, aged 18 plus, a peer-led program that has been co-designed with the disability community. Diversexy aims to build confidence and self-esteem around sexual and respect and reproductive health, and increase understanding of healthy, intimate relationships. The program sits within co-health's prevention team, and it is made possible through integrated health promotions funding. Diversexy is sponsored by the following organisations: City of Yarra, City of Darebin, Bringbank City Council, Melbourne Polytechnic, Anecto, Valid, West Casa, North Casa.
A few housekeeping things. Please use the chat function if you have any questions for the panel discussion that is happening towards the end. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of your questions as we only have 15 minutes for discussion. At approximately 2:10 p.m, we will be having a 5-minute tea break. This is an opportunity to eat your Diversexy cookie if you have received it and managed to resist. We also have 2 Auslan interpreters here, Georgia and Kat, who are waving their hands. I'd like to hand over another member of the Diversexy team, Megan, who will be introducing our first speaker.
Thank you, Jess. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce Chantelle Otten. Chantelle is a Melbourne-based psychosexologist who is passionate about empowering people to feel great about their sexual health, self-esteem, communication, and education. A Melbourne local, Chantelle comes from a Dutch background, having spent time living, studying, and working in Holland. Chantelle has grown up with a European mindset that talking about sex, pleasure, and relationships does not have to be shameful or taboo. A natural-born communicator, she enjoys creating a setting where her clients can feel relaxed and free to talk about their sexual health in a safe, judgment-free environment. With numerous awards, accolades, and published medical journal articles, Chantelle is not only an internationally acclaimed psychosexologist, but also a caring and empowering sex educator. With a background in scientific research, sexual medicine, and counselling, she believes that sexuality and self-esteem are an integral part of life, which everyone is entitled to. Good sexual health should always be enjoyable, pain-free, and without prejudice. Chantelle will be speaking about the importance of people with a disability in being able to access their sexual rights. Please join me in welcoming Chantelle.
Thank you so much, everyone. What a lovely introduction. So I am a sexologist, and for those of you who don't know what that means, it basically means I am a psychologist who helps with any type of sexual questions, concerns, or problems that you might have. I see a lot of people with different disabilities, and I'm also in an interabled relationship myself with someone who you might know. His name is Dylan Alcott. So I have always seen people with disabilities, and if we can go over to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about what kind of myths we see about sex and disability, which I'm sure you are all very familiar with. So look, anyone with a disability is just like everyone else. They have sexual needs, they have desires, they have feelings, and they have fantasies. And I do believe that there is a huge barrier in society for people who live with a disability to express their sexual needs. And I do think that there is an assumption that people who have a disability are not sexual, which, as everyone on this call knows, is completely not true. I think this comes down to these, I guess, concepts of normality and beauty and barriers that people face with a disability around independence and also mobility too. I also just think that there is a lack of understanding from able-bodied people on how to be erotic with someone with a disability. So that is myth number one. And that's one thing that I'm really trying hard to debunk, because I know personally and professionally that people with disabilities are very erotic people. Myth number two, living with a disability is not considered attractive or desirable. Now, this is, of course, absolutely not true. And I think we've all been exposed to this message that sex is only for people that look a certain way. You know, we see a lot of movies with really beautiful looking people having penetrative sex. They have an orgasm in a minute and they're like crying out with happiness, and it's very passionate. Now, that is not normal sex. That is something that I like to call a Disney view of sex. And I think that we need to move away from these rigid and false ideals about what kind of people are allowed to be erotic and what ideal there is around beauty that exists in society. So who is sexy? All of us. Who is desirable? All of us. And you know what? At the end of the day, those with a disability are human sexual people who really don't show up often in movies or in advertising. So they do get this short straw of not being represented well in media. And that also needs to change moving forward. So we definitely need to see more movies with people with disabilities having erotic times. And maybe we need to see some porn with people that are disabilities that are not fetishized, but more loving or fun or consensual as well. Myth number three around sex is something that I talk to all my patients about. And that's this idea that sex has to be spontaneous. Now, anyone who is able-bodied or disabled must know that if you are setting up for this to be a preface of your sex life, you're in for a very disappointing time, because sex needs to happen once you have thought about it, you've talked about it, you might have to plan it. And look, for people with a disability, it does require a bit more assistance sometimes, or preparation. And I like to tell people that sex is more responsive. So it happens after maybe you've been touched or you've talked about it or you've planned it, rather than spontaneous. Now, what about people having real sex? This goes into myth number four. There are so many ways in which we have sex that are not about penis in vagina. In fact, if we talk about penetrative sex being the way that we have sex, we're actually skipping out on a whole heap of people that aren't able to have penetration. And that means some people in the LGBTQI+ community. That means people who might not be able to have penetration due to sexual pain or erectile dysfunction, or people who have just maybe some different body movements. Maybe there's scoliosis involved, or hip tilts, or maybe they have pain in their joints. This means that they're not having what media considers to be real sex, but in my eyes, they're still having sex. It's just a little bit more fun and creative. It involves toys, it involves hands, it involves mouths, it involves touch and eroticism. And sex is for everyone, no matter what label you want to put on it. There are no rules governing what sex can or cannot be, except that it involves mutual consent, respect, and safety. Thank you. So myth number 5 is that people with a disability don't need sex education. And I think that goes into this idea, if people with a disability aren't sexual beings, then why would they need sex education? Again, another myth that we need to debunk. Sex education is often misunderstood as teaching people how to have sex or permitting experimentation. But what sex education actually encompasses is more than just mechanics. It's about figuring out how to be sexual for yourself. It's about knowledge and information on how to have safe and pleasurable sex, prevent STIs, stop unwanted pregnancies, and protect yourself from, I guess, having not pleasurable sexual experiences. My job as a sex educator and as a sexologist is to show you how to have as much fun as possible, how to enjoy your sex life on a deeper level, and how to be erotic. So let's move on to the next slide. Thank you. Now, this slide explains a little bit more about how every person is a sexual being, and we all have thoughts, attitudes, feelings, and fantasies around sex. Having a physical or intellectual disability doesn't change your sexuality and your desire to express it, nor the emotions to have it. Of course, anyone who has a disability here knows you're erotic beings just as much as anyone else who is able-bodied. It's just that people need to know more about what you find erotic. And that comes with confidence on knowing how to discuss those topics, which is where I come in. I provide a very safe space to be able to talk about what kind of eroticism you want to have and, I guess, how you want to channel it. Now, as a sexologist, I can be limited. And as you can see in these images, we have a lot of people in wheelchairs or as amputees. It's very hard for me to find images of people with a disability online that are in LGBTQI+ relationships or that have erotic images like this, but even more so, I feel like these images are quite safe and maybe a little bit constructed. But on my social media, a huge part of my job is putting out information into the world around certain types of sexuality. And I must just say, there is a lack of representation around those with a disability and how they are erotic beings. It's definitely gotten better in the past 6 months or so, but I would absolutely, would love for anyone to reach out that has more erotic images or more resources that I can look at as well. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So sex is really important to everyone, but I do feel like for those with a disability, my patients certainly come to me and they feel a little bit stuck. First of all, they feel like they miss out on some things. They miss out on certain activities, and I know my partner has explained that to me as well. And I think that what we need to talk about first and foremost is how important sex is to your identity. And I think that if we marginalize those with a disability, then we are denying people of exploring their sexual identities. My job is to be able to look at what sex can bring to you as an individual. And we know for those who have some physical disabilities, it can help with relaxation and stopping spasms in your legs, or it might create some spasms. It depends on how excited that you are, but it also helps with orgasm and just settling out mood as well. It also increases your endorphins in your body. So it helps with pain reduction, it helps with stress management, it can boost immunity, and it can help with bonding between you and an erotic partner or romantic partner as well. Let's go to the next slide. So as you can see here, we have a sushi platter on top of human beings. I want to talk on this slide a little bit more about what sex and eroticism is and the difference between them. So when we talk about eroticism, this is when I'm really talking about you and your creativity and your imagination. We're talking about how you connect with your erotic imagination. how you think about hopes, how you think about dreams, what kind of games you play with yourself, what kind of imagination and fantasies you have that are way beyond sex as well. And I think the problem is these days, when we have a problem with erotic connection, we have a problem with imagination, which can be very common for those in age 2021, especially after coronavirus has limited the way that we're able to interact with our imagination and also with other people too. So what I want you to do, anyone who's listening, is moving forward, really learn how to tap into your imagination and encourage it, foster it, celebrate it moving forward. So I'm going to also talk about how sex does not mean penetration, as I discussed before, but sex can actually mean a menu of sexual options, which is why I've put these nude people here with sushi on top of them, because I wanted to give you an example that sex can mean just having eye contact. It can mean touching each other's skin. It can mean talking about sex. It can also mean hand play or mouth play or ear play or chest. It can also mean having a full range of sex toys that are able to help with certain types of stimulation for either you or you to use on your sexual partner. And I want you to think about penetration and orgasm being on the dessert menu of your sexual experience. We have so many entrees and mains that we want to try with some different spices or sauces. Really think about your sex life as a very big menu with different types of cuisines on there. If you have the same type of menu every single time you're having sex, you're going to get bored and you're going to lose your desire. So mixing it up is super important. Now, if we can go on to the next slide, this is a really good point for me to talk about what we can do when we look at disability in the community. And those of you who have a disability here, I'd be very interested to know how you feel. Someone with a lifelong disability, if you haven't had an erotic experience yet, which a lot of my patients haven't had, they long for what they haven't got yet. So I really work with specialists, with sex workers, with tantric coaches, and other types of hands-on sexologists to work with the patient on engaging in their sexuality and having erotic experiences. I want everyone to be able to have an erotic experience and ongoing erotic experiences in their life, because it does make up a huge part of their sexual identity. Now, for those who have an acquired disability, this is something where we can run into a bit of emotional trouble. We get people coming in longing for what they have lost. They used to have sex in a certain way and they can't have that type of sex anymore. And they don't know how to expand on their sexual ways or preferences or moves. So they might go years without having sex with their partner because they're just not sure what to do. My job is to educate those people and those with lifelong disabilities on how to have new and fun, sexy ways to find pleasure with themselves and their partners, and embrace their capabilities and any changes that come with their aging process or with their physical mobility. So my job's to normalize sex for the patient and for the couple. And look, I think one thing we need to acknowledge here is when there is an acquired disability, no one actually talks to the partners on how they can manage being erotic with their disabled partner. And that's something that I very much put a lot of priority onto, because my belief is you can have sex in any way you want to have sex, and there are no rules to expressing your sexuality. Let's move on to the next slide. My job here is maximize your erotic capability and also work with you and your partner in the couple. I want to provide as much information as I can about the physical, emotional, or relational possibilities that you have, and try and make use of every single erotic opportunity that you have, and also expand your sex life and give you a safe space to be able to talk about things that you're not able to talk about with anyone else. So that might involve me talking about positions, talking about sex toys, talking about how to pat your partner, sex workers, oral communication, and I look at the patterns and consequences. So maybe if you have a stable disability like SCI, or maybe you have a progressive disability like MS or MND, how we work with those conditions moving forward and make sure that we ensure a safe and healthy sex life as you progress. And if we can move on to the last slide. It's very important for me to say that we cannot stereotype anyone with a disability or make an assumption about their desires or needs. Some people that I see are very vanilla in the bedroom and they just want a little bit more romantic kind of sex. And some people I see are very opposite of vanilla. They are 50 shades of grey, they are kinky, and they want to have a good time in the bedroom. It's not my job to make any types of assumptions about what type of sex you want to have, but it is my job to make sure that you are experiencing erotic contact, sexual excitement, and sexual satisfaction. And you know what I like to say that anyone that is able-bodied is erotic lives for those with a disability and at the start of our comfort zone, because some things that I have learned being in an interabled relationship I would never have considered before getting into the relationship I'm in now. And I think that's our final slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantelle and
That's okay.
Sauce, for that.
This is my dog Sauce, everyone.
And Sauce for that important presentation. I'd now like to hand you over to Victoria from the Diversexy team, who will introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Sorry, I wasn't mute. Thanks, Megan. I'd like to introduce Sol and Emma from Touching Base as an organisation that assists people with a disability and sex workers to connect with others. Sol is the president of Touching Base in Australia and has over 30 years experience as a sex worker in New South Wales and Australia. Sol is a founding member of Touching Base and community work, as it's been recognised internationally when he won the UK Sexual Freedom Award, Sex Worker of the Year 2016. Emma is training coordinator at Touching Base and has 15 years experience as a sex worker and is the president of SWEAR, WA Western Australia Peer Sex Worker Support and Advocacy Organisation. Emma has a degree in community services and is a nationally recognized sex worker peer educator. Welcome, Sol and Emma talk about the experience of sex worker supporting people with a disability to achieve their sexual goals, health goals. Yes, welcome.
Thanks, Victoria, for the introductions. Hi and welcome everybody. My name is Saul, and thanks to our hosts for inviting Touching Base sex workers to be a part of this forum. I'm on Gadigal land in Sydney, which belongs to the Eora people, whose sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So Touching Base is a not-for-profit organisation run by volunteers. We're based in Sydney and was founded in 2000 by sex workers and people with disability and our allies. Touching Base developed out of the need to assist people with disability and sex workers to connect with each other, focusing on access, addressing discrimination and human rights. Touching Base provides people with disability, their families, and support people with information about how to access sex workers. And we run a referral service of disability-friendly sex workers and sex worker establishments across Australia. Sorry, I meant to say next slide. We're having our slides put forward. So that's kind of the first slide I've already got there. Or, excuse me, this is my first webinar. We'll have to move along to the next slide now. So Touching Base helps to raise the public and professional awareness of issues including how to access sex services, and we facilitate disability awareness training for sex workers and service provider awareness training for organisations and disability service providers, which is an important part of our work. And we also produce resources for clients and their families and support people. I'm going to hand over to Emma now.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma. I'm the training coordinator here at Touching Base, coming to you today from land of the Noongar people in the Whadjuk region in Perth, WA. So thanks for having us today. We're really excited to be here. First up, we're going to show a short video featuring Rachel Otten, who was one of the co-founders of Touching Base, who's also a sex worker. This 2014 SBS multimedia essay shows Rachel with one of her clients, Colin, who has cerebral palsy, discussing their experiences. It's about 5 minutes long. Just bear with me while I share my screen.
Everyone likes and desires touch. Can you tell me about the first time you've had sex?
That was what a story. I got this tingling throughout the body. I had never been taught anything about sex. When I became high, I thought, oh, is this what this is for?
Hey!
Oh, good morning.
I see him, I think, once every 8 weeks, and yeah, he has a good imagination and we get along, and he's a lot of fun and I really enjoy seeing him. I mean, we all have our favourites. It's about the teasing, it's about the caressing, wanting to feel close to someone, hearing and feeling someone's heartbeat, and the warmth that you get from your skin when someone's spooning you. So many times people are just getting dressed and undressed by nurses and carers and support staff and parents and siblings, whereas the way I undress someone will be very different and it can be very sexy and sensual. You can undo putty bra and you can hook their finger through your bra strap and so that they can help you get undressed.
I like trying different things. I get a bit more adventurous. Over time, it does get better.
Better for you or better for both of you?
Better for me, I guess. The lady wouldn't keep doing it if it was better for them too.
I don't think anyone else has the right to say, no, you can never be touched because you have cerebral palsy, therefore you can just lie in that bed and we'll transfer you and we'll wash you and we'll clean you and put clothes back on you and we'll take you bowling, you can go to the movies, but no, you can never have someone lie down and spoon you or touch you and caress you and have sex with.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. We really were thrilled to see people putting so much work into providing a really high quality example of the sort of connection that can happen between sex workers and people with disability. If we could have the next slide, please. So historically, people with disability have been infantilized and had their sexual needs and desires ignored or downplayed or written off as behaviors of concern. But countless studies have demonstrated the desire for intimacy and sexual experiences held by people with disability are widespread. Acknowledging the sexual rights of people with disability has recently been brought to the spotlight in Australia with the highly publicised case of a woman with multiple sclerosis who was initially denied access to sex services using her NDIS funding by the agency. She took her case to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal in 2019, who ruled in her favour. The NDIA then appealed this decision, but the federal court rejected their appeal in May last year. And this was a significant step forward in acknowledging the sexual rights of people with disability within the government framework. We also always emphasise it's important to note that sex work should not be seen as the only viable option for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. People with disability have the right to receive sex education, access sexual health services, and pursue a safe and satisfying sex life level with their peers. This is supported by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and the World Health Organization's document promoting sexual and reproductive health for people with disabilities. And we've got a lovely image there from one of our Mardi Gras parades where sex workers and people with disability have paraded down the streets of Sydney to the applaud of hundreds of thousands of people, which is really quite a phenomenal thing as well that we've been a part of in bringing the sexuality of people with disability into public view. We were the first float in the Mardi Gras to include people with disability in our float in 2002. Next slide, please. Some of this has already been covered by Chantelle, but we're noting that some of the personal benefits to people with disability in accessing sex work services improves their quality of life and happiness. And that was something which the federal court found was an important outcome for the woman with multiple sclerosis. It can boost your self-esteem, reduces stress and feelings of depression, can improve sleep and circulation, and can temporarily decrease pain, particularly if you've had an orgasm. You can get some good benefits from orgasm in regards to pain relief. Next slide, please. Some of the practical benefits of that we've heard from people accessing sex workers is that it can provide hands-on experience in the correct use of safe sex equipment, such as condoms and dams and lube, and increase the knowledge and confidence of sexual acts in your own body. It can help in developing other skills around communicating and negotiating your sexual desires, and an opportunity to explore positive sexual experiences as a part of healing or recovering from negative past experiences. I think many people can acknowledge that sexual abuse can have a profound effect on people with in a whole range of areas of their life where there's been non-consensual abusive situations in a sexual context. But I think the other side of that is positive, affirming sexual experiences can also have an effect across a broader spectrum of a person's life. It's not just about what happens in the bedroom. Your experiences in the bedroom can have a positive impact in other areas of your life as well. Now I'm going to hand back to Emma for the next slide. Thank you.
Okay, so talking about experiences and perspectives of sex workers who see people with disabilities. So sex workers who see clients with disabilities also report positive benefits, including personal satisfaction of performing meaningful work, making a positive contribution to a client's happiness and well-being. Shared understanding between the person with disability and the sex worker of both facing stigma and discrimination. It expands the sex worker's knowledge of disability and related skills, for example, learning alternative communication methods, and promotes the sex worker's own personal growth. These positive benefits are echoed in many recent studies, including Rachel Watten's own dissertation, Sex Workers Who Provide Services to Clients with Disability in New South Wales, in which one of the surveyed sex workers is quoted as saying that for them, the most positive benefit of seeing clients with disabilities is, and I quote, being challenged to be sexually creative when someone has limited movement or dexterity, and in doing so, discovering that a person's sexuality is not defined nor necessarily limited by the body they inhabit, but is limited only by our imagination and willingness to explore. Sex workers are also able to expand their awareness and knowledge by attending one of Touching Base's PDAT workshops. PDAT stands for Professional Disability Awareness Training, in order to build their capacity and confidence in working with clients with disability. The PDAT and SPAT workshops were developed in response to recommendations taken from Touching Base's first training and partnership forum in 2001, which was informed by people with disabilities, their families and supporters, and identified issues such as the lack of specific awareness or education around how people with disability could access sex work services, as well as the lack of disability awareness training being available for sex workers themselves. Next slide.
So one of the most important parts of our work is, of course, bringing together people with disability and sex workers in a meaningful way. So we operate a referral list which is a directory of disability-friendly sex workers and commercial sex premises across Australia, with many of the sex workers on the referral list have attended our one-day awareness training workshop. It's important to note that the referral list is a referral service only. Touching Base does not actually make the bookings or provide the sex workers, but we do use our expertise to select the most suitable matches for the person who put in the referral request, depending on what information they've provided. And we provide the person applying for a referral with contact details for sex workers and brothels, and it's up to them, the client and or their support workers, to contact the sex workers or premises to inquire or make a booking. The referrals can be made by the person with disability themselves or by the person's family member, friend, a carer or support person once the person with disability has given their informed consent. And looking at our referral requests, it's about 50-50. We find 50% of the people have filled out the form themselves and 50% have had some assistance in doing so. The referral request form can be found on our website, both as an online form, or we can provide a Word document that people can download, fill in, and then email back to Touching Base. And our referral list volunteers generally reply to the requests within 1 week. The referral requests, the number of people on our referral list was reduced during COVID-19 shutdown as many sex workers withdrew from offering services, particularly in Melbourne because you had such a long lockdown. But we are actively seeking sex workers to expand the choices available in your area again. Next slide, please. So when it comes to accessing sex services via the NDIS, the topic has been a hot topic both in the media and in disability circles recently. As mentioned earlier, the woman with multiple sclerosis won her case in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and in the Federal Court. But many people are still under the impression that sex work services cannot be funded by someone's plan, because that is what the minister said. But the minister never had the power to rule it out. And that is something which has become clear from the Federal Court decision. The NDIS funds may be considered reasonable and excuse me, necessary supports for things like sex therapy, sex education resources, sex-related adaptive technology, and also sex work services. But as with all NDIS supports, it's all about the wording. A person's NDIS plan goals must reflect their need for these supports. Their plan goals could be based around their need to access sex education from a sex worker, or based around building their sexual capacity, building their emotional regulation capacity by accessing sexual relief from a sex worker, and so on. Next slide, please.
Okay, so the NDIS support lines and categories that sexual services can potentially be funded under include improved daily living skills under capacity building funds, improved relationships, innovative community participation, which is a new support line in capacity building. And the specific support line item that was used by the NDIS participant who was involved in the recent administrative tribunal case was assistance in individual living arrangements for persons with complex needs from their core funding. And we do know for a fact that this isn't just sort of hypothetical, that people have been funded through NDIS to access sex work services. And more detailed information about all of this can be found in the NDIS and sex work handouts that are available on the Touching Base website. Next slide, please. Okay, so how can you support person with disability in accessing sex work services? Okay, the first thing you need to do is let go of any assumptions or preconceived notions you have about sexuality and disability. For example, thinking that a client having an intellectual disability or being nonverbal equates to an inability for them to express informed consent or lacking desire for sexuality and intimacy. You should also familiarise yourself with sex work laws in your state, which I had to do, seeing as I'm in WA. So in Victoria, sex work is controlled by what's called a licensing system. So although sex work is technically legal, it's highly regulated by the state government, with private sex workers needing to be registered as such with the Prostitution Licensing Authority and having restrictions on aspects of their sex work, such as sex workers being unable to work from their own residence or a hotel or motel booked in their own name, as well as heavy restrictions on what wording they can use in their print and online advertising, meaning sometimes accessing sexual services can prove confusing to navigate. Disability service providers and organisations can also take part in Touching Base's Service Provider Awareness Training, or SPAT, workshops, which can be customised to suit the organisation. Next slide. If you're seeking more resources or information, you can reach out to organisations that promote and uphold the sexual rights of people with a disability, such as Family Planning Victoria, SECA here in WA, Northcott, and of course Touching Base. You should also listen to lived experiences within grassroots groups and online forums, such as the NDIS Grassroots Facebook group, Diversexy, and so on. Because we all know there's no substitute for lived experience, peer-based knowledge, and skill sharing. If you're an NDIS participant or their support person and are struggling to have your request for sexual services to be included in your NDIS plan heard by your support coordinator or LAC, or if they're unsure of how to support you in requesting these supports from the NDIA, you should seek out the services of a disability advocate in your area. A few we suggest you can start with are Valid in Victoria, the Office of the Public Advocate, People with a Disability Australia, and Disability Advocacy Network Australia, and there are many others. Next slide. You can gain more knowledge and advice about accessing sexual services by getting a hold of some of Touching Base's resources, such as Seeing a Sex Worker, a guide for people with a disability. This is a comprehensive booklet written in plain English and is suitable for adults with a disability and their supporters who want more information about accessing sexual services. It includes information about choosing a sex worker and where to find them, expectations and etiquette, establishing consent, and so on. Anna Sees a Sex Worker and Tony Sees a Sex Worker are two separate pictorial booklets that outline male and female heterosexual stories of visiting a sex worker and are written in plain English. Next slide. Touching Base's Policy and Procedural Guide is a three-part framework for assisting clients to access sexual services. It includes policy statements, a principle and guidelines template, procedural guidelines, and an assessment tool to assist in determining the suitability of sex workers and sex work premises in meeting clients' specific needs. And the NDIS and sex work section of the Touching Base website is an information hub for all things NDIS and sex work. There are frequently asked questions, info sheets, and a timeline of articles relating to the recent successful AAT case. Next slide. Scarlet Road is a documentary exploring sex, intimacy, and sexuality of people with disability, featuring Touching Base co-founder and sex worker Rachel Otten, who is in the video that we featured earlier. Most of these resources are available for purchase via the Touching Base website.
Another resource that we produced last year as a result of getting some funding from Northcott in a fundability round was to produce an augmentative and alternative communication resource that uses core boards of picture communication symbols to support communication between people with disability and sex workers, but it's also helpful for people with disability to explore and explain their sexual desires and needs and wants to support staff as well. We'll make a copy of this resource available to cohealth, and we're planning to develop it into a digital resource. We were initially funded to produce 100 copies, and we're pleased to say that almost all of them have been distributed now, but hopefully with cohealth having a copy, which we'll post to you, there'll be one available there that perhaps could be lent out by cohealth, fingers crossed. Next slide, please.
Cool. So there's other third-party resources that also might prove useful. One that I would highly recommend is the SECA mobile app. The SECA app is a free digital resource that supports access to relationship and sexual education for people with disabilities. It has interactive activity boards with drag and drop picture communication symbols, tap to voice tiles, and is compatible with eye gaze technology. And you can download the SECA app for free from app.seca.org.au or from the SECA website. Last slide. Oh, we've already got the last slide up. Cool. So that's about it from us. We'd like to thank all the attendees who have come along and joined us for our presentation today. And thanks so much to cohealth and Diversexy for hosting this awesome forum and for having Touching Base take part. You can check out the Touching Base website at touchingbase.org for more information and resources. And we encourage you to reach out to us here at Touching Base if you wish. And we'll be back at the end for the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks to Sol and Emma, we are now going to have a 5-minute tea break. Feel free to grab a cuppa, and if you have one of our Diversexy biscuits. See you soon.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
All right, beautiful. Okay. Welcome back from the break. We'd now like to introduce Jax Jacki Brown. Jax is a disability and LGBTQIA plus rights activist, writer, and educator. Jax runs their own business in LGBTQIA plus disability rights and inclusion, where they provide guest speaking, education, and workshops and training. They are a member of the Victorian Disability Advisory Council and the LGBTQIA plus Task Force Health and Human Services Working Group, where they advocate for LGBTQIA plus plus disability communities. Jax is interested in how we can build resilience, pride, and community for people with disabilities. Jax will now be speaking about the importance of allyship for people with a disability who identify as LGBTQIA+. Welcome, Jax.
Thank you. And sorry, my use of that acronym there stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and asexual. It's a bit of a mouthful to keep saying it. So thank you so much for introducing me, and it's really exciting to be here today. I've really enjoyed the other panelists and what they've brought to the conversation. So I'll try and add things to what they've said and not repeat points that they've already expertly covered. So I want to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations on whose land I am this afternoon, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people present with us today. This land was never ceded, and the process of colonization, occupation, incarceration and genocide that began over 2 centuries ago continues to this day. In the face of this, however, Aboriginal people have strength, resilience and pride. There's a photo that you should all be able to see on your screen, but I'll describe it as well. So it's an image from the First Peoples Disability Network of Australia. It's one of their fabulous meetings where they all come together. There's people in wheelchairs, people on crutches, all kinds of different impairments. And it's an organisation, the First Peoples Disability Network of Australia, is an organisation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disabilities. So they really work at the crossover points or the intersections between race and disability. And if you haven't heard of them, I really encourage you to look them up, read some of the fabulous advocacy work they're doing, and find ways that you can amplify their voice and support their work. So a quick visual description of me. I'm a white person with short dark hair and glasses. I'm wearing a black t-shirt with bright red watermelons on it. Something about me you can't see is that I'm a manual wheelchair user, which really influences the way I move through the world, the spaces I have access to, and also the ways people relate to me, the kinds of relationships I've been able to form, the discrimination I sometimes experience, and also the fabulous sex that I've had. I would like to state up front that I think people with disabilities, we're just better lovers. We're better lovers because we've had to think outside the box in terms of bodies. We've had to experiment with what feels good, what we want to do. We've had to learn about how to say yes as well as no, and how to have consent and control over what happens to our bodies, because often as people with disabilities, particularly people who've grown up with disabilities, we've had a lot of stuff done to our bodies by the medical profession as young people, often without our consent. So I think sexuality and reclaiming our sexuality and exploring what we want to do is a really key way to find some healing around some of the traumas we might have experienced. And as a queer, gender diverse person, I think that I've been able to really think about what does it mean to have a body? What does it mean to live in this particular body? What kinds of things do I want to explore? What feels good? What pushes my boundaries? And how can I communicate that? How can I find people that want to explore that stuff with me? So I just wanted to start with a quote by a queer disabled activist called cohealth, and they're Melbourne-based, and they're fabulous. If you haven't heard of them, I really encourage you to do a Google and check out some of their work. But they say ally means partner. Also, I've heard someone who cares, someone who'll be there when the walls fall down. Ally is an action. It's an alliance you build, not something you identify as. And I really like that quote because for me, allyship is about working alongside somebody. It's about really listening to them and who they are and what they want to do, and using your position, using your power and privilege, using your connections to really support them and really hear what they're telling you. And I think this is particularly true when we think about gender affirmation and we think about sexuality for people with disabilities. I'm just going to skip through some of these slides in the interest of time. So this is a quote that I love about disability, which says, disability is not a brave struggle or courage in the face of adversity. Disability is an art. It's an ingenious way to live. And I like this because it gets to think about disability as not being a tragedy or as not being an object of inspiration, but as being something that is about diversity, something that is about ingenuity, something that is interesting and engaging and of value. And the second bit on that slide there says disability is part of human variation, it's part of diversity. And that's how I like to think about it, that it's part of the makeup of what makes us human. Disability is always going to exist, whether people are born with it or whether they acquire an impairment at some point in their life. What do the people that are currently living with disability have to share with those of you who are yet to experience disability? I really quickly wanted to touch on different models of disability. So different ways that we can think about what does disability mean. So often the way that we think about it in Western society is the medical model of disability. So this idea that the problem of disability is located in the person. The problem is the fact that someone uses a wheelchair. The problem is the fact that someone has an intellectual disability. They're the problem. That person is the problem. And from the medical model comes, all the specialists that try and treat or cure us. There's also the charity model. So this idea that all people with disabilities need is the kindness of strangers, is someone to help them buy that new piece of equipment or fund a support worker. But then in the 1980s in the UK, in response to the medical and charity models, came this idea of the social model of disability. And people with disabilities came up with this model themselves. And the social model really turned this stuff on its head and said, the person isn't the problem. What is the problem is all the barriers in that person's life. The inaccessible transport, the lack of employment opportunities, the lack of affordable, accessible housing in somebody's life, but also the attitudes people might hold about disability, often unconscious, like the stereotypes of someone with a disability as just a poor person who sits at home being sad all the time, or they're just inspirational for going to Woolies and buying that cucumber. Who knows what they're going to do with it, but anyway. That those attitudes are the things that disable or limit people and limit our opportunities. So the social model says that disability is a social issue. And if the barriers in our lives have been created by an inaccessible world and by attitudes, then we can challenge and change them. And this idea has been really fundamental to disability rights and to asking people who are not yet disabled to be our allies in changing things. And then off the social model of disability and the hard work that disabled people had done came the human rights model. So this idea that disability is a human rights issue, it's an issue of access. And the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is a key tenet of that model. Here's a hot queer image of me and my partner having a pash. So we've been together about 7 years now, and we have a 3-year-old together. We don't get to pash in the streets as often these days because we're often parenting or working or doing far more boring things. But we still do often pash. And I wrote an article when we first got together, when we were in those kind of first 3 months of passion, when you can't keep your hands off the other person because you just want them so much. And I wrote an article for a queer magazine called The Politics of Pashing, about how, as a queer disabled person, going out and about with my partner and holding her hand or kissing her, that people just weren't used to seeing it. It was nowhere in the media. It was nowhere on the streets. People were just kind of unable to kind of know how to respond because it's something we never see. And so I wrote this article, and the editor said, I'd really love to have some photos to accompany your great article. Would you, we'll get a photographer out and you can go take some pashing photos about the city. And so I said to Anne, my partner, I said, would you like to come pash me? And she said, sure. And so we took a series of images. This one's in De Graves Alley on a bright Saturday morning. And she sat it on my lap and we had a massive pash, and the photographer just kind of disappeared into the crowd. And it was really interesting because people just didn't know how to respond. We went into a cafe and had a pash as well. And people just kind of thought that there must be some kind of art happening because it was so like weird and odd and no one had ever seen it. And I think that that's really interesting and speaks volumes. The fact that we never see these kind of images in mainstream television, in mainstream media, that young people with disabilities growing up can't see images of themselves being desired, being wanted, that queer folk with disabilities and gender diverse folk can't see ourselves represented. You can't aspire to be something or to accept yourself fully if you don't see those parts of yourself represented positively in the society that you're part of. So I know this is just one image, but I think having more of these images is really, really important. So we've covered a lot of this, and in the interest of time, I won't go over what the previous two great presenters have already covered. But I think it's really interesting to think about, particularly for trans and gender diverse folk with disabilities, that often we're assumed to not know our trans or gender diverse identities, that it's assumed that we must be cisgendered. So by that I mean when we're assumed to be a girl when we're born, then everyone continues to assume that that must remain our identity, and we might feel like we're not a boy or a girl, not a male or female, somewhere in the middle, or we might affirm that we identify as a guy. But often for people with disabilities, people assume that we won't know who we are, we won't be able to make those transitions in our lives. And so we just don't have the access to make those choices, and the access to people that will affirm those identities, the access to, you know, those peers, those young people who might say, oh, that's my part of my identity too, this is okay. You can come and hang out with me. Often people with disabilities are more socially isolated. Just briefly, I wanted to touch on what does allyship look like for LGBTQIA+ folk with disabilities. So be across what the acronym means. I know it's a lot of letters, but the L for lesbian at the beginning there, what the issues are for lesbians with disabilities are different to trans or gender diverse folk or bisexual folk or intersex people. So do spend some time understanding what the different issues are for the different communities, so you understand how to be an ally. Be across different pronouns. So my pronouns are they, them, which means I don't want you to say she, her when you talk about me. Please say Jax, they. And that's really important because that lets me know that you're a safe person, that you respect my gender. So be across different pronouns. Some people will use she, her, he, him, they, he, they, she. It may all sound a bit confusing at first, but just listen to the way the person is talking about themselves and then use that language when you're talking to them. And if you get it wrong, just say, oh, I'm sorry. I used the wrong pronoun. I said she for you today, and I know your pronoun is they. And just move on. Don't make a massive deal about it. Just move on and continue the conversation with that person. Know that gender is a spectrum, which means that you can move along from male to female. You don't have to kind of stay at one or the other. you can move along in between those two. So that's really important to know, that people can change how they feel about their gender. Don't make assumptions about a person's gender identity based on how they look or how their voice sounds. Often people hear me talk and then assume a particular pronoun for me based on the tone of my voice. And that's not accurate, that's not true. So really, again, listening to the person in front of you. For LGBTQIA+ folk with disabilities, we know that we experience higher rates of violence, abuse and neglect than people who aren't LGBTQIA+ and don't have disabilities. We know that we experience ableism, which is discrimination against people with disabilities, homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, and that the very people in our lives who should be supporting and affirming our identities, our family members, our support workers, are often the people who are being unsupportive, or who don't read up on the issues or find the language to support us. We, as we've heard today, one of the key issues for people with disabilities is that we don't get given inclusive and accessible sexual health education. And often when we do, it's not LGBTQIA+ inclusive. So it might be very kind of, assuming that someone is a cisgendered man and wants to sleep with a woman, that kind of stuff, assuming that people are having kind of penetrative heterosexual sex, as opposed to all the variations of kinds of sex that we can have and queer sex that we can have. We know that people with disabilities have less opportunities to form relationships. And also the last point down there, that the NDIS is really not friendly to LGBTQIA+ folk. I did a lot of advocacy in my plan to make sure that I have some goals which are clearly stated in my goal, in the heading of my goal, that it's an LGBTQIA+ goal. I want to feel connected to my community. I want to feel supported to parent my child so that she's connected in with that community. But a lot of people don't feel like they can disclose that to their LAC. They mightn't feel like their family would be supportive of them talking about that part of their identity. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done for people to be given the kinds of choices in their lives and the funding in their plans. I just really wanted quickly to touch on the impact of COVID on LGBTIQ folk with disabilities. I know we've been very lucky in Australia so far, but I don't think that we're at all safe yet until our population is vaccinated and we keep those vaccinations up to date. So in the disability community, there is a lot of hesitancy around return to work and return to life as normal because people are feeling more vulnerable and are more vulnerable to having increased risk and comorbidities and potentially death if they get COVID. So for service providers, one of the things that I'm hearing very clearly from the community is that people want a choice of services. They want online services to continue, as well as in-person services. So people feel like some of the barriers they're experiencing, some of the hesitancy to go out into the world they might be experiencing, they can still get the services and supports in their life that they need. Almost at my last slide shortly, but this is a cute photo of me and my kid. She's a bit bigger than this now. But I guess I just wanted to touch on disability and parenting as a side of activism and advocacy. Often people with disabilities are denied the choice to become parents. People are put on contraceptives without their knowledge. People are still forcibly sterilised in Australia. And people are just prevented from getting the kinds of supports that they might need to think about having a child. And then if they do have a child, the kind of support that they might need to parent that child. we know that particularly for women with intellectual disabilities, child protection often comes in really early in the pregnancy or in the early months of that child and parent relationship, and is really, will remove that child, even though the person hasn't really done anything and is just learning how to be a parent like any other new parent. So we really need to see more supports around parents with disabilities to support them in their skills around parenting. Often as a queer, gender diverse person, people assume that I'm not the parent of my kid, even when we're interacting in a way that, if it was anyone else, they would think, oh, that's probably the parent of that child, because they don't read people with disabilities as parents. When I go out with my partner and my kid into society, to the local coffee shop or whatever, people never read us as a family. They always read her as the mum and me as the kind of friend that must have just rocked up or whatever, because they don't read queer families. They don't see queer families, and they don't see queer families with disabilities. And I've already talked about my goals there. I wanted to talk about resilience, and then I'm going to finish up. But I think resilience is a really important thing to talk about, particularly after we've all lived through the 2020 that we lived through. And we might be feeling like our resilience is somewhat waned, and that's totally understandable. I think for people with disabilities, and also for LGBTQIA+ folk, finding a sense of resilience is really important. And resilience doesn't just, you don't just get it and then it's yours forever, and you have that same kind of well of resilience. It moves up and down. It waxes and wanes with the different things that are happening in your life. And that's okay. That's totally understandable. It's the same with pride. One day you might feel a lot of pride in who you are, in your disability, in being trans. Another day you might feel like, oh, this is all too exhausting. I'm sick of coming up against these barriers. It doesn't mean you don't have pride. It just means it's dipped for a little while, and you've got to find ways of building your resilience again. So I think some of these things apply across LGBTQIA+ folk and folk with disabilities. And one of the key things for me is awareness of oppression. So awareness that the barriers that I come up against, whether it's inaccessible buildings that I can't get into, or, inaccessible trams around Melbourne, or, some attitudes about who I am that I don't agree with. That it's not me that's the problem. It's the fact that we've been taught that disability, as a society, we've been taught that disability must be a terrible or inspirational thing. And it's those things that we need to dismantle and change. And we need to make a more inclusive, accessible society. So knowing that I'm not the problem, but society is the issue, really helps with framing where I need to do the work and what I need to change. And being a positive role model for others, I think, is really important. And by that, I don't mean I always have to be perfect. Of course not. I think showing young folk with disabilities that I'm just human, that I've got a lot of different parts that make up who I am, that they can be all that they are, and that they'll find people that will value them, people that will love them, people that would desire them for all that they are, disability included, not because of their disability, not in spite of their disability, but because disability is a valued part of who they are. And I think we don't often hear that message as young people with disabilities, that one day you'll get to a point where you can feel proud of who you are, where you can feel positive about what you bring to the world. And I think talking about disability in that way, and talking about all the kind of wild, interesting sex that you can have because of your body being different, because of your mind being different, that's the kind of conversations we need to keep having. And I would love to, yeah, I'd love if people have questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. I'm going to share my contact details now. So if you feel a bit too shy in the Q&A time to ask them, you can always reach out. I'm a bit of a nerd for LGBTQIA+ disability stuff. So I've got a bunch of resources and books and all kinds of things. So if this has sparked your interest, please feel free to drop me a line. Anyway, thank you very much.
Shane, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I fixed it up now. Thanks to Jax for that important presentation. It is now time for the panel discussion with the participants. Thank you to those who submitted questions before the forum, as well as during. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all the questions as we only have a short amount of time with our guests, but we hope you will find the discussions interesting. The first question for all panel members: how can family, friends, support workers and providers be a good ally for NDIS participants when they want to put sexual health goals in their NDIS plans?
If no one else is going to leap in, I'm happy to make a couple of points here. Thanks, Jax. Great to see you there. Thanks for your presentation. I think the important thing is to let people know that you're open to discuss their sexual needs. You know, giving people permission to talk about it is kind of a key step to begin with. As Jax mentioned earlier, don't make assumptions about gender or gender identity or sexuality or sexual preferences. You know, allow people to even not know themselves, to be exploring that as a part of the process. And I think it's important to be clear about your own boundaries as well. How far are you willing and able to go to support people? You know, you want to help, but be aware also where your own boundaries lie, I think. And if you communicate that, say, look, I'm really glad to help you to arrange for this or to support you to go there, but I'd feel a bit uncomfortable about actually undressing you in the bedroom and positioning you for sex. I mean, it's fair enough to have your own boundaries. But I think a really important thing to remember is that people have the right to dignity of risk. You know, it's really important to balance that, you know, that everybody has the right to take risks. If we don't take risks, we don't extend our capacities or our understanding of life, you know, and everybody has the right to take risks, and you balance that. You know, it's a balancing act, but, you know, it's important to remember, I think.
Yeah, I would say, and I think it was mentioned before, ahead of going into like an NDIS planning meeting and supporting somebody, really connecting them in with an advocacy organization or an advocate who's got some knowledge in this area, doing your research, reading up on touching bases resources, for example, because the way that you will need to be able to talk about your goals and how sexuality and sexual services relate to your goals and why they're important and why they're reasonable and necessary. You know, it's quite complex in terms of the level of language that you're expected to use, so that person who maybe hasn't encountered you know, a queer person before or whatever, actually understands who you are and what you're advocating for and why they should include it. So spend some time outlining clearly what your goals are and how your support requirements relate directly to those goals, and take that document in with you, take that work in with you so that you're ready for that conversation.
Brilliant, thank you. This next question is for Jax. How can we get information about being a good ally to the LGBTQIA+ community?
Yeah, great question. Look, I think there's, I'm Victorian based, so I'll speak for Victoria. I think there's a lot of great resources out there now. I just saw yesterday there's been a big injection of funds by the state government into the LGBTQIA+ community, which is awesome. So I'm sure you'll expect to see a lot more resources happening in the next few years, which is great. But look, Dobbin Street Services, Thorn Harbour Health, co-health, all the big kind of players in the LGBTQIA+ sector have a lot of really great and comprehensive resources, and a lot of organisations now through ILC grants, through NDIS grants, are actually doing work in the disability and LGBTQIA+ space, creating resources with the community, for the community. So there's a lot of stuff that's been what we call co-design. So with people with lived experience, creating the work that's out there. So yeah, just go and have a look on all those kind of websites, see what's out there, connect in with people with lived experience in the community, follow them on Twitter, follow them on social media, see what they're engaged with, and yeah, be connected in with their voices.
And if you love books, Heroes and Hyenas. What resources and supports are the panel aware of for people with a disability who want to become parents?
I'm a parent. You can probably hear Frozen going on in the background. Sorry, my kid's homesick. So she's on to Frozen 2. I don't just listen to kids' movies for fun. Look, to my knowledge, there isn't particularly much out there, and I'd love to be corrected on this. There's Reinforce, which is a Victorian-based group for folks with intellectual disabilities who are parents. There's a book that's going to come out next year on parenting and disability. It's an anthology. I may or may not be in it. But look, I would love to see some more stuff around parenting and disability, and particularly how to get those supports in your plan, because I had a lot of trouble advocating for some support, particularly because my partner is a woman, and they were like, well, she's the primary carer of the child and you're just the disabled other person. So it was quite hard to get them to realize, no, I'm actually the other parent and I want to actively parent my child. So I'd love to see some resources, and if anyone else knows things I don't know, please tell me.
I've seen there's some stuff on the Family Planning New South Wales website. I'll add the link to the chat room to the Family Planning website, because I did see there was some stuff there on parenthood as well, and they've been really progressive, you know. Family Planning in New South Wales, they're a partner of ours in training, so I've just added that to the link. You'll have to just have a look through, just do a search on their website, and there's a whole disability and sexuality section, and they also have a library that you can borrow from, and they'll mail that out, so there's some resources there.
Thanks for that. The next question is, what is the best way for sexual supports to be included with an NDIS plan?
Did you want me to answer this one, Saul? Or okay. So as we discussed earlier, it's important to link the need for supports to your goals. So I've got a note here. Natalie Hammond OT in New South Wales, who's provided reports for NDIS covering access to sexual services, suggests a couple of things to consider when thinking about what is a reasonable and necessary support. So looking at, when you're talking about goals, what positive changes might happen from accessing sexual services, and what negative consequences might happen if sexual needs remain unmet. You can also find more information on the Touching Base website. There's a whole section on NDIS and sex work. So there'll be some more suggestions in there. And I also just quickly wanted to address a couple of the sort of side questions that were in the chat just before relating to this. Someone asked, what if their plan manager or support coordinator or LAC doesn't believe that sex work is an appropriate use of participant funds? So at the end of the day, that's not their choice to make. They're actually there to support you in getting the services you need. Their personal judgments or whatever shouldn't even factor into it. So look, if they're not willing to support you in trying to access those supports, then probably try and get a new plan manager or support coordinator or LAC, or if they're willing to learn, then you can sort of direct them to the resources that we've got on the Touching Base website, which clearly outline, yes, sexual services are, possible to be funded through NDIS and sort of the support lines and that kind of thing. And as for someone asked, wanting to know if they would be made to repay funds if they access sex work and then NDIS change the rules later on. As far as I know, I don't think they would make people pay back retrospectively. I think it just depends, what sort of the guidelines and stuff are at the time. I doubt they would sort of, change the rules and then say, oh, well, retrospectively you have to pay us back for that sexual service you accessed 2 years ago when the rules were different. Saul, anything you want to add?
I've just added into the chat room an extract from the sort of goals that we've got in one of those resources on our website, so that's really conveniently available for people right now.
Shane?
Sorry, I was on mute again. Next question is, what are some meaningful ways that prevention organisations can support sex workers and sexual services to be recognised as a legal service for people with a disability through NDIS?
I'll jump in on this if you're happy for me to do that, Emma. So one of the things that happened when the issue first came up, when the minister sort of came out into the media saying no prostitutes at the beginning of the year, everyone got pretty worked up about that, understandably, because he was using inflammatory language. And so we began lobbying with peak disability organisations to provide a response to that, and letting them lead the conversation, because we think this is important for something for important issue for people with disability to lead in. But when the issue comes forward again, which we anticipate it will come to Parliament, then there'll be a process of consultation with people, and there'll be a whole range of opportunities for people. The organisations will reach out to our grassroots members, asking them to provide some input into the consultation that will happen in the federal parliament if they do try and get those changes through to rule out sex services under the NDIS. And I think the other important thing is to support the full decriminalisation of sex work. In Victoria, you still have a very restrictive, prohibitive licensing model that creates a distortion. That means that only a certain number of people can operate legitimately in the way that they would like to operate. We don't have the same choices as other industries. So I understand that in Victoria currently there's a proposal to introduce decriminalisation, which has been moved towards Parliament. So again, when that happens, hopefully we'll get some support from our allies in the disability community supporting the full decriminalisation, which will increase the choices that are available for people with disability as well.
Thank you. Now, one of our attendees has an important question. How can I access support surrounding sex, sexuality and gender that also respects my experiences with psychosocial disability and isolation? It needs to be online or outreach if possible. So Emma?
Sorry,
You're
can
on
you
mute. Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
can you repeat the question
Yes,
again
yeah.
for me? It's
How can I access support surrounding sex, sexuality, and gender that also respects my experiences with psychosocial disability and isolation, and it needs to be online or outreach if possible?
I'm not sure. Maybe connecting with local disability advocacy support networks like PWDA is a national organization that may be able to provide some insights on that. But I can't actually off the top of my head come up with a direct response to that.
I would probably suggest also asking in some sort of online support groups like the NDIS Grassroots Facebook group, because, you know, that's a plethora of sort of information and resources there for people.
Brilliant, thank you. And the next one I have is, are there any known dating websites for people with a disability? And is there a way to get support for coverage of the costs for these websites? Anyone?
I don't know. I'm in a long-term relationship, monogamous relationship, so I'm probably not the best person to ask these days. But when I was doing a lot of online dating, which is how I met my partner actually, there wasn't any disability specific ones that I knew of at the time. There was a UK one, I remember, but they just asked really crap questions. Like they just they wanted a lot of like, what's your medical diagnosis, this and that, and I'm just like, that won't tell you what kind of spunk I am in the bedroom. Like that doesn't tell you the kind of things that I want you to know about me if I want to go on a date with you. So I haven't seen any that I know of that are Australian based, and if there was one, I would love to see it, you know, be engaging and interesting and frame disability as an interesting part of somebody's identity, not as, you know, something that's with a medicalized kind of focus.
And also be wider with its scope of like including everyone from all different backgrounds and sexualities, because a lot of the ones for the LGBT kind of community are honed in on kind of little sections as well. So yeah.
Give people a bunch of drop-down options or open text boxes in terms of how they want to describe their sexuality, their gender identity, their disability, all that stuff, so you can put who you really are and the language that's important to you in there when you want to, you know, reach out and date somebody. But no, not to my knowledge, sadly. Maybe if there's any tech wizards out there and people with some money they want to spend, maybe that's an ILC grant. I don't think the NDIS would fund a dating website for disabled people.
No. Okay, thanks guys. Shane?
Next question. This question also comes from the community. How do I add sex workers in my plan? What tools, communication aids are available for people with disabilities who don't use words to communicate, and or people who have intellectual disabilities or autism?
So you're on mute.
Sorry, I lost the bloody window. Sorry, Emma, I was going to say, you had a great resource from SECA. Maybe you'd like to mention that.
Sorry, I was the same. I was looking for a different resource at the time and sort of half missed the question. So in terms of, tools and communication aids that are available for people with disability who are non-verbal, or who have issues communicating verbally. So you can look at the resources that we mentioned earlier that are on the Touching Base website, and as well as the AAC resource that we're hoping to turn into a digital resource as well. I believe Saul's going to be sending a hard copy to cohealth as well. So that's a really fantastic resource. That's sort of picture communication system in sort of a core board setup, and that enables people to sort of communicate their sexual needs and desires to support people, as well as facilitate communication between the person with disability and the sex worker. And also, so the SECA app is not specifically for sort of sex work per se, but it is a really great resource for sort of facilitating that communication about relationships and sexuality and sexual education between people with disabilities and their support people.
Hey, Emma, can you spell out how it's spelled? Is it an acronym?
The SECA?
Yeah.
It's SECCA. I can, there we go. Yeah, that's it.
I think we've put the link in the chat.
Yeah, so if you just put in SECA WA in Google, and it will come up with their website, and the first thing on their website is a link to download the app.
Brilliant. Thank you. Our last question is from Phoebe. I'm a shy woman and I have Williams syndrome. Sorry if I mispronounced that. I'm very lost in the sexuality world, and I'm just wondering how I put myself out there. Anyone? I could speak from my own experience if people like. So I'm single and part of the LGBTQIA plus community and disabled as well. And it's been quite a few years since I've dated. I think everyone's journey back or into the world of dating and relationships and sexuality is very personal to you. Some people like to meet with people just by chance and physically. Others like to try online dating. Others like to connect with friends of friends. So I think it's important to listen to what you feel comfortable with and take it step by step, because everyone's journey is a little bit different and affected by various things. But yeah, just make sure that you feel comfortable with everything that you're doing, and seek support when you feel a bit unsure. So now we'd like to thank all of our panelists and everyone who's contributed to the discussion, the questions and everything. We really, really appreciate it. And I'm going to hand back over to Megan.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks, panelists, as well. Can I just echo what Jess said? That was amazing. We've now come to the end of our forum. So thanks to all the presenters, Chantelle, Jax, Emma and Saul, for your insightful and informative presentations. If you want to get in touch with any of the presenters, please head to their respective websites, which will be added to the chat. Victoria.
Yeah, good job, everybody. Fantastic job. Lots of useful information on my end. Thank you to all and attendees. We hope you have found this forum valuable and continue to advocate for the sexual health needs of the disability community. We've added a link in the chat, and we'd love to hear your feedback about today's forum. This will be also emailed out. Thanks again and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks,
awesome.
guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us.